Hey, where you guys want to go today? You wanna relax and take a nice long break on the beach? What about up in the mountains, seeing over like the big landscape? Okay, let's just go back to the deep dive and we'll get that started. What is up, guys? So today we are actually back with another deep dive, and today we're actually looking into a pretty highly requested Pokemon. Today we're actually looking into Claydol. Claydol is actually a ground and psychic type Pokemon. At level 40 with 15s across the board, you can max out at 1971. Now you can achieve a 1498 with a 0 on attack, 14 defense, and 15 stamina at level 29.5. So not too bad there. According to my spreadsheet and all the math that I have done, Claydol should rank somewhere around 4th in bulk in the entire cup and actually 2nd in stat products. So pretty nice stats there. And that is actually due to his base stats here being really nice and actually pretty well spread out for PvP. So a 140 on attack, 229 defense, and 155 stamina is the ideal spread that we want, being the lowest on attack and then our defense and stamina being the next two highest stats there. Moving on to our moves, we do actually have 2 psychic fast moves, and then we do have a ground move here, a steel move, which of course isn't going to get stabbed. Then we actually have our other psychic move here rounding out our charge moves. Let's actually go over our fast moves here. So confusion for 3 energy per turn is going to yield you 4 damage per turn, and after you factor in stab, that's a whopping 4.8 damage per turn. That's pretty big. Extrasensory is our other fast move, clocking in at 3.33 energy per turn with a 2.67 damage per turn, and that after stab does yield us a 3.2 damage per turn. Now in terms of fast moves, there's not a whole lot of competition with confusion just because of this huge damage output right here. There is a little bit of a noteworthy point to say that Extrasensory does gain you that extra 1/3 of an energy per turn, but in most of the testing that I've done, it just doesn't pay off. Definitely want to stick with Confusion as our fast move here. Moving on to our charge moves, we do have Earthquake as our first move, which Earthquake is actually really good. So 65 energy to fire for 120 damage at a 1.85 damage per energy ratio. After you do factor in stab though, you do bump up to 144 on the damage, which is a whopping 2.21 damage per energy ratio. Yeah, that's freaking huge. Gyroball is our next move here, clocking in at 60 energy to fire for 80 damage at 1.33 damage per energy ratio. Unfortunately, since it is a steel move, we don't get the stab bonus off of it, but it's decent. It's at least kind of lower costing than our other moves. Psychic here is our last charge move, clocking in at 70 energy to fire for 100 damage at a 1.43 damage per energy ratio. After you do factor in stab here, you do get a 120 on the damage and a 1.71 on the damage per energy ratio. Pretty interesting. So with our moveset, I actually did try 2 separate movesets here, and that's because Confusion, Earthquake, and Gyroball was definitely the preferred moveset. And I looked at the numbers and I was like, well, I wonder if it would make too much of a difference if I actually had Psychic. Unfortunately, it actually doesn't. So it actually keeps the same numbers, and you'll see when we get into the shields here, it keeps the same numbers in the 0 versus 0 and the 2 versus 2, but it actually starts to lose matches in that 2v0 and that 0 versus 2 situation. So did you guys see anything? So moving on to our shields here, we actually do have a 0 versus 0 shield situation, which is kind of like our closing type situation here. We actually end up winning 40.3% of those matchups, which is decent. It's not huge, but it's definitely not bad. And then we move on to our 2 versus 0. So when I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any shields, we actually end up winning 91% of those. But that's not the important part. We actually want to know which ones out of the Pokemon available do we actually end up losing against. Which actually, a lot of these are the Dark type and the Grass types. Yeah, so when you factor in like Umbreon and Alolan Raticate, both of those can do really well up against us here, and even the Shiftry and the Nuzleaf can actually do pretty good damage up against our Claydol. Of course, we are going to take super effective damage from all 4 of those Pokemon, so that kind of makes a little bit of sense. Even when we have complete shield advantage, they are able to completely destroy us without any shields. Now, if we were to actually go with Psychic in this situation, instead of actually winning 91%, we actually bumped down to an 89.6, which sounds like we end up losing just one more matchup. Our next scenario is actually our 0 versus 2 scenario. So where I have 0 shields and my opponent actually has both shields, we actually want to figure out which Pokemon we can just flat out beat no matter how many shields they have. And with that, we actually end up winning 20.9% of those matches. Now, those are actually the ones that we're looking for here, and most of those are actually from the fighting typing. In that 0 versus 2, we only end up losing to 2 of the fighting types, which is Gallade and actually ends up being Lucario. So, unfortunately, we do end up losing to 2 of those, but if we do have 0 shields, we can still take out most of the fighters there. Now, if we're actually using Psychic instead of Gyroball for this scenario, we actually bump down from that 20.9 down to that 19.4. So we end up trading off for another loss rather than gaining anything. Our last scenario is actually the 2v2 situation here, so that's more of like a opening type situation. We could actually end up winning only 37.3% of those, which is kind of a bummer. I was hoping that this number would be higher considering that this number was kind of lowish, but it actually does end up telling us that we do prefer to close with Claydol. We will in most cases do better when we close with Claydol rather than opening. Next, we're actually going to move on to some matchups here. So just a disclaimer, all the simulations run on this side of the board are definitely with a 1v1 shield scenario to try to give the most evenness amongst both Pokemon. So in all of the deep dives, I end up taking our subject Pokemon, of course Claydol today, and I end up putting them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon just to kind of see how they do. Well, Claydol actually doesn't do too bad here. So Wobbuffet, Metang, Grumpig, and Poliwrath are actually no big deal for us. Now, you may notice that Poliwrath we don't talk about too often. That's actually because he's the 11th bulkiest Pokemon in the cup. So on the losses side, we actually end up losing to Umbreon, Hypno, Bronzong, Alolan Raticate, Slowbro, and Slowking. Now, Hypno kind of sounds weird at first, but remember it does have access to that Shadow Ball, so it can end up hurting us pretty bad. Umbreon, Dark type, Alolan Raticate, Dark type, Slowbro and Slowking, tons of neutral damage, plus they actually have Water type damage, which is going to do super effective damage up against us. So, pretty much actually they end up having a lot of super effective damage no matter which way you slice it. And then we have Bronzong here. So Bronzong has a star beside him, and that's because, of course, PvPoke does actually like to give Bronzong the Feint Attack moveset rather than the Confusion type moveset up against another Psychic typing. And with that, we actually end up losing to Bronzong, of course, with the Feint Attack. So I was like, well, what happens if we end up using Confusion? Unfortunately, we still end up losing that matchup as well, so Bronzong is actually a no-go. Even though we do have access to that Earthquake, he can actually just output a ton more neutral damage with his Steel-type charge moves than we can before we get to Earthquake. Next, let's actually talk about some counters here. So this top section here is what we should actually be focusing on whenever we're using our Claydol, and this bottom section is what we're really going to be wanting to bring to the table to actually combat the Claydol here. So what should we actually use Claydol for? We definitely want to be focusing our attention on the fighting types here. Lucario is actually the only one that we end up losing to whenever we switch over to that 1v1 shield scenarios. We actually end up taking out all of the other fighters, which is great. And then we actually have a specific Pokemon here. Alolan Raichu. Yeah, Claydol ends up being a really nice counter to Alolan Raichu, which is why a lot of people are looking at him in the first place. So definitely be focusing, if somebody switches into Alolan Raichu, definitely throw out your Claydol because, oh, it's going to be a really rough time on that Alolan Raichu. Now, in terms of what we should actually be bringing to the table to actually counter this Claydol, well, the Dark types. Of course, with us carrying a Psychic typing, any kind of Dark type move is really going to put a hurting on us. But on top of that, the Dark types that actually carry some Grass type moves end up giving us a lot of problems as well. So the Dark types, yeah, they pretty much can clean us up. And then we also have some Psychics down here. Now, I did look into a lot of the Psychic matchups here, but unfortunately we only end up beating the ones that are either slower or can't at least put out neutral damage to us. It's the ones that have to go up against us with that resisted damage to the Claydol. If they have any kind of neutral damage or super effective damage, they pretty much can beat the Claydol here. He is extremely bulky and he can tank quite a bit. But when you factor in that neutral damage and that super effective damage, unfortunately he just can't end up tanking enough, and he ends up starting to lose to a lot of the psychic types even in this cup. So last but not least, let's actually go over a couple of pros and cons for our Claydol here. Let's actually start with the cons. Of course, we get the bad stuff out of the way first. My only con that I have for Claydol is that he loses more than he wins. Unfortunately, in the 0 versus 0, the 2v2, the 1v1, he always ends up losing more than he ends up winning, which is unfortunate. He doesn't have a positive side to any of the even shield situations, unfortunately, and he ends up just losing more often than winning. But that doesn't stop him from actually being pretty good up against most of the fighting types, which is a general purpose for all of the psychic types. And he does get one of the best neutral attackers in the cup out. I mean, he flat out just beats Alolan Raichu. Plus, he does carry all those fighting type matchups with him, so he's not actually too shabby. On our pros though, we actually end up having huge bulk. So this high, really high defense number right there is crazy. Unfortunately, his HP stat isn't like super high, but it's definitely high enough to give him a lot more bulk than a lot of other Pokemon. So he does have really, really high bulk, which helps him in a lot of scenarios inside the cup itself. And then our other pro is actually back to that Alolan Raichu. Being that Alolan Raichu is one of the best neutral damage outputs in the cup, having something to really just tank a ton of that electric type damage really does help a lot for Claydol's case. It really does boost him a lot in terms of just a really, really good counter up against the Alolan Raichu. So that is actually all that I have for Claydol today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. Always remember that if you have any deep dives that you're looking forward to, please comment them down below, as I will put them in the spreadsheet, tally them up, and then we'll get to them as quickly as possible. And always remember that if you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you could be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.